I'm Gavin Miller from MICA Architects, and we're delighted to have been invited by London Society to put together what is the first of 3 sessions on London's evolving transport model and its impact on the city. Clearly, a lot has happened in the past year, and I'm sure lots of you have got thoughts on it. And we thought it would be really helpful and useful to have a series of sessions where we can share what will be in session 1, what we think have been the emerging impacts and emerging trends as a result, principally what's happened since COVID in the city and how that affects how we move around the city and transport patterns and effectively the model of the city in itself. And then the next session from tonight, we'll move on to looking at and testing some scenarios. That's probably in September, hopefully in a real environment, not a virtual environment. And then in November, a session where we can conclude on various thoughts and recommendations. So we move on. So tonight's session is on impacts and emerging trends, and really we'll be thinking about what has happened in the past year already, how much of this change was inevitable, or has it effectively been accelerated by COVID, and how will this affect the future of London and the future of the city. So we've split tonight into a series of sections. Clearly, this is a transport-generated webinar, but like everything, transport is intertwined with the whole city. So the first part of the talk will be on transport trends and implications by Adrian Cole and Magdalena Misiewicz of Steer. We'll then move on to the impact on property and the high street and all the kind of trends happening there. That will be chaired by Martin Woodhouse and Amanda Robinson of PRD. And then we'll take a look at the kind of structure of the city and how ready London is to, or not, to accept or accommodate these kind of changes and kind of emerging patterns. And that will be led by Phil Berczuk of Steer and a little bit from myself. And then we will break into a Q&A session for about 13 or so minutes, and then have a summary. Now, I think you're also encouraged to fire away questions as we are going through the presentation, so we can then share them with you at the end. We move on to. So just some emerging thoughts, some little thoughts for consideration. What's happening in London? Well, there's indications that there's may well be the first drop in London's population since 1982. There are trends of some form of exodus out of the city in terms of cost of living and so on. We know there are changes to living and working patterns. Potentially return to work attendance will be at least 22% down, if not a lot more, depending on where you are. We know that in terms of public transport usage, that TfL expect public transport to not return to 2018 levels until at least 2030 and possibly 2035 for inner London. So it's a 10-year plus recovery in terms of public transport usage, which is worth bearing in mind as a prediction. Other things bearing in mind, this anticipated change of working patterns and hours may well lead to the reduction of peak services and an evening out of services across the day in tube and train. We know that for buses to work effectively, we really need to achieve a 10% reduction in traffic so that we can make them work and collaborate. Also in tandem, how do we still at the same time promote cycling and pedestrians? And as you'll find out, obviously, a lot of vehicular movements have unfortunately increased during the pandemic in certain areas of London. So how do we balance these against the kind of desire to be much more sustainable in how we operate? So it's also worth bearing in mind that within this next 10 years or so, this recovery, this will be in parallel, obviously, with new trends in e-commerce, changing shopping patterns, and that's already happening, and how that's and deliveries and how that's impacting on London, and obviously with potentially new mobility coming in. So it does feel we are at a kind of certain point, strategic point, where we need to perhaps address how we would need to and want to respond to the future. So that's just the intro. This is the first section, transport trends in London, and this will be led by Adrian Cole and Magda Misiewicz. Adrian is director of Steer. He's worked on transport planning and development projects around the world. With most of the experience within London and Southern England, he works extensively for Transport for London, London boroughs and landowners. And Magda is a consultant at Steer, specialising in data collection, visualisation and analysis. She frequently works with big and telematics data to support development projects, master plans, policy, and strategy recommendations. So over to Adrian and Magda to take you through kind of transport trends and various impacts.
Thank you, Gavin, and welcome to everyone on the webinar. I'll start off with some general remarks. Magda will then take a deep dive into the data, and then I'll finish my session with a discussion of some of the trends which seem to be emerging, and also I think setting out some points for discussion which hopefully will generate some good Q&A later on. So moving on through the slides, we're going to look at what really happened when COVID hit, and that Magda will particularly look at that in terms of the impact on the transport networks. What were the big changes, which modes were particularly affected, and what are the future implications? So next slide. I mean, I think for a long time, this is a very classic diagram for transport planners, and it's what central government's been trying to do forever and a day, which is to actually encourage us to travel less. If we are traveling, shift to modes which are more sustainable, like walking, cycling, public transport. Or if you are still wedded to your wicked vehicle, perhaps you would be trying to switch fuel, so you could use a low emission vehicle, like electric vehicle or hydrogen vehicle. And I think when the pandemic hit, a lot of that happened. So there was a lot less trips going on. The modes, as we will discover, didn't quite work out as we thought, and Gavin's already alluded to that. In fact, that people did shift mode a lot, but the health message overrode absolutely everything else out there. So we have got a lot more car use than we had thought, which is obviously going to cause problems. And because we've got a lot more car use, and because electric vehicle technology is still catching up a bit, that is causing short-term problems in terms of environmental impacts. So moving on to the next slide, I think this is where Magda starts. She's going to take you through some data sets now.
Right, so we're going to have a bit of a deep dive on what happened to transport and different transport modes. And if you just start looking at what happened to workplace travel and looking at Google mobility data, well, when the first lockdown started, we were down by 80% compared to our usual travel demand. And that travel demand slowly recovered over the next 4 months, peaking around August time. But then with the next second and then third lockdown, the demand went all the way back down to 80%, down 80% below the average. And we actually peaked at the very, very bottom in January of 2021. Now, that was the overall travel demand. If we now have a look at what happened to public transport demand, you'll see that while the workplace travel demand did indeed increase over the summer, then dropped down over the lockdown, and then bounced all the way back, when it came to public transport, the story wasn't so cheerful. So public transport demand dropped also down to 80%, but then it only recovered by about 40% of that change. And it just went away. So what happened, and what happened with those remaining 40% trips? Well, if we have a look at the next graph, we'll actually see what modes became more popular over the last year and a half. So in the beginning, prior to COVID, we had a very, very strong proportion of people either walking or cycling, but also using public transport. And then with the onset of COVID, that public transport mode share dropped down to around 10%. And there was a steady increase, and still is a steady increase, in the percentage of car trips. Now, sort of positively, the active travel mode share also increased over the period of COVID. And in fact, even though the mode share of active travel sort of stagnated since 2018 in London overall, while it kept on growing in other parts of the UK, it did manage to sort of make more of a dent once COVID started. But what happened to public transport in more detail, because that's the one mode that's actually not bouncing back. So if you skip the next slide, you'll see that the mode that was sort of the most affected was actually London Underground and other rail modes, while buses, while still significantly affected, they actually fared a bit better. In terms of road traffic, Here we're looking at a section on traffic on the Transport for London road network. The travel demand, even though it dropped down originally by a half, it then bounced back to pretty much the normal in only about 4 months. Now, delving into some of the less popular modes of travel or maybe networks, if we skip to the next slide, you'll see that the overground, trams, and DLR pretty much all but shut down, but then they also managed to grow back a bit quicker than the London Underground. Now, what might be happening here is that public transport actually grows back faster in outer London rather than in inner London. And so if you have a more detailed look at a cross section of a line, say, for example, the Jubilee line, the next slide, you'll see that the peripheries of London, so if areas like Queensbury and Kingsbury or West Ham, didn't decrease as much when COVID started, and then they also bounced back a bit faster, while that didn't really happen in central London areas or areas where there's lots of office areas, so Canary Wharf, Canning Town. There, the travel demand change was the most severe, and that demand didn't grow back so quickly. Now, if we focus on the nice clean green modes, cycling and walking, let's see what happened with cycling. So cycling fell down pretty rapidly compared to 2019 at the beginning of the pandemic, but then over the summer months, it actually grew back quite nicely. April 2021 was actually the best month for cycling and for walking in a long time. It exceeded the 2019 averages by far. And that was a combination of the lockdown easing, of good weather, and also of a couple of bank holidays. And for example, in that month, in April 2021, the actual travel demand to places like retail and park spaces also exceeded by far travel demand of 2019. Perhaps that was a bit of a perhaps everyone really wanted to go to a pub, because if you actually have a look at what happened to travel, to work at home, we will see that that the work from home actually declined the most once pubs were closed. Even more people actually started working from home when the pubs closed down rather than when the second lockdown kicked in. Also, the fact that schools closed down at the same time might be a bit of a factor, but let's focus on the pubs. Now, in terms of pedestrian travel, West End and south of West End, sort of central London areas were most affected when it came to pedestrian travel, while the peripheries also fared a bit better. But then that proportion of walking trips didn't drop as much as as public transport trips did. Now, what grew during the pandemic is actually car travel. So if you skip to the next slide, you'll see that while car travel originally dropped pretty much fell off a cliff. If we have a look at what happened in 2021, on the next slide, we'll see that the demand actually grew to numbers far greater than have been experienced over the past couple of years. So here we're looking at the vehicles observed in the congestion zone. And you can see that the 2021 demand far exceeds what was experienced in 2019, even 2018, 2017, meaning that what might be happening is actually a car-led recovery of travel demand. Now, Adrian is going to cover the scenarios in a bit more detail, so I'll give the floor back to him.
Great, thank you, Magda. Well, I think to summarise, I mean, clearly, as a result of the pandemic, overall travel demand has reduced, which is good. That's what we've been trying to do for years, and personal trip rates have been falling in London. Typically, it's about 2.5 per person per day about 10 years ago, and it's gone down to about 2 per person per day at the moment, which is great in a way. And obviously, the main reason for the travel demand falling was less commuting, less higher education trips, less tourism in central London. And as Magda's highlighted already, public transport demand significantly reduced as a result of COVID, and it's still very, very, very depressed. So we've got short-term impacts on revenue, and I don't need to sort of labour that. There's endless discussions in the press about TfL's finances, and that is all related to the fact that a lot of their their financial model is based upon fare box revenue, which is basically not happening at the moment. Against that, actually running peak public transport services is quite an expensive thing to do. So if less people are travelling around at peaks, there is the opportunity to replan services to actually cater for future demand. We think there'll be probably a flatter demand for public transport during the day, perhaps less demand to and from the centre, which does mean there are opportunities to replan rail services and also start working with some of the other things on central government's agenda, like moving more freight by rail. That could be a real opportunity if we free up train paths. One good thing during the pandemic was cycling demand was relatively steady, and even though cycling to work went down, there was evidence there was a lot more cycling for leisure use, particularly at weekends. There's a lot more cycle travel than there had been before, and that was actually also noticeable outside London, where we've been working with a lot of local authorities who it was actually the first time they'd really felt they needed to make quite extensive provision for cycling, just because there was pent-up demand from their residents to get around by bike. So I think that's been a very good thing, and clearly something that we're all looking forward to planning for as we go forward. We've talked about the demand for road travel is already back to pre-COVID levels, which is partly because we've all been having more home deliveries during the pandemic, and we think that trend's going to persist. So the problems we've got with that is there've been efforts over a number of years to try and reduce traffic congestion. We're not really into building new road space generally now, which is just because of the environmental impacts. But the problem we've got is if there's more traffic on the road, it's more difficult to actually reallocate the road space towards the more sustainable modes. And I think that's been a particular experience in the low traffic neighbourhoods when road capacity was taken out. And that's actually caused quite a lot of local bad sentiment, I think, in terms of how difficult it is to get round by car, just because more people are trying to drive around. There's actually less road capacity there. And obviously, in terms of trying to meet the government's carbon zero agenda, we have got this short-term challenge, really, until electric vehicle usage increases, that we've got more people driving around in sort of petrol and diesel vehicles, emitting fumes, and adding to the that sort of bad environment. So moving on to the next slide. And I think Gavin made that point at the beginning. I think up till now, transport planning has been viewed as quite sort of precise art, and some of you on the webinar will be familiar with databases like Trix and Tempro, very, very accurate forecasts of how traffic and travel will behave, quite explicitly linked to the growth in the economy. And I think some of those links have been broken now. And certainly our own work, which we've been doing internally with experts, and we're starting to apply on a number of projects, we're starting to look at a variety of scenarios as to how transport and travel might behave as we emerge from the lockdown. And our graph there shows a variety of scenarios relating from the top to which is a magic bullet scenario where we get virtually back to normal in terms of how we all behave, and the orange at the bottom is sort of continuous sort of repeated lockdown scenarios, which I must admit, when we started doing this work we thought was a bit absurd, but we sort of seem to be a bit in that sort of situation at the moment with more sort of strains of virus coming around and people quite reluctant to, I think, to get out and travel. And so I suppose the reason for using scenarios is we're sort of trying to frame what might be happening in the future. We won't be so precise, but then because in a way we're not being so precise, perhaps we're not going to be sort of missing out so much, and we perhaps might have a sort of better sort of range of certainty over how things work. So moving on to the next slide, we're not the only people doing scenarios. TfL have been doing a variety of scenarios, including the 5, 20, 30 scenarios there in these sort of circular blobs, which Gavin will talk through a bit more later on. And TfL are already working on the early recovery, steady state recovery scenarios. And if we move to the next slide, that shows you what's happening. So TfL, with their own models, predicting in the short term that we much less travel demand than had been happening pre-COVID. And I think it's fairly obvious from this slide that the centre is where there's going to be a massive reduction in travel demand compared to where we were before, and that's going to be the area that's going to pick up less quickly. There's all this donut effect. So once you get to the outer London boroughs, there will be suppressed travel demand, but probably not as bad as it could have been in the centre. So if we move on to the next slide now, and if we look at change in road-based travel by demand by borough, this is where we got the problem. Is every borough except the City of London is showing an increase in road-based travel demand in the short term, which again illustrates the point I've just said, that we've got this highway network which is going to become under increasing strain, and it is going to be much more difficult to rebalance the capacity in that network to more sustainable objectives. So I think moving on to the next slide, I'll summarise here before we move on to the next session. So I think sort of in terms of transport planning, I think we do need to think of a range of possible scenarios in the future. And that's not just about sort of transport and modes, but it all relates back to where we're going to live, how we want to live, and where we're going to work, which are topics which are going to be explored in the coming sessions. It's very unlikely that public transport will be back at pre-COVID levels before 2030 at the earliest. So that is quite a challenge for how we plan and pay for public transport. And I think the other thing is we will start moving away from, in the past, we've had these very, very precise databases where we predict what's going to happen and then provide on that basis. And in a sense, we've got a bit more flexibility now. I think we can actually decide sort of what are our priorities for the transport network, provide on that basis. And so look at it from the other end. So if you've got a sort of certain amount of transport capacity out there, people will use it. And I think we've got a lot more choice now in how we influence that compared to where we were. And clearly, massive environmental and sustainability problem with the way road traffic is growing at the moment. We do need to reduce that. We need to rebalance road space towards more sustainable modes. We've done it in the past. The cycle superhighways were introduced in central London, rebalanced substantial amount of road space towards cycling. So it can be done. And I think we need to sort of be bold and do that again, not just sort of fall in with the fact that car traffic is increasing. So we've got to plan for it again. And last but not least, we do need to cater for new mobility, such as the e-scooters, a variety of modes you can use. So I think that probably wraps up where we're at for this session, and we'll move on to the next now.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian and Magda. So I mean, really quite a clear pattern emerging in the past year, but clearly a dilemma now about how to respond to it and what we should do. So the next session is the property section. And this is led by Martin Woodhouse and Amanda Robinson of PRD, who are going to talk a little bit more about London's high streets and how they've recovered. Martin is PRD's Director of Development. He has 20 years of experience in market-facing proposals for development around infrastructure projects, as well as designing and structuring delivery vehicles and capturing value for the public sector. Martin is a member of the Mayor of London's infrastructure panel as well. And Amanda is a senior consultant at PRD. She's got experience across a range of practices in the built environment. She's currently supporting the GLA to roll out its substantial new high streets data service. So I'll hand everyone over to Martin and Amanda.
Thanks, Gavin. So we'll talk today about how the high streets have recovered so far. London high streets have recovered so far during the pandemic. And we're going to talk more specifically about how COVID-19 has potentially acted as an accelerator of change for what's going on the high street and in the local economies around London. We're going to think about the changing patterns of working, spending, travelling, visiting and investing, which I think will relate to the things that you've heard in the previous session and what will come afterwards. We're going to consider where the policy focus is and the general awareness of London's move towards polycentric city and GLA's High Streets for All mission. And then we're going to really kind of focus on the data-led impacts on London's high streets and the opportunities for recovery, which Amanda will take us through.
Thanks. Thanks, Martin. Just a quick word on where we get this data from before I start talking about the maps and the graphs that we have to show you. We mentioned the High Streets for All mission on the last slide. As part of that, the GLA has set up High Streets Data Service and Partnership, which we've been supporting for the last year. And what this is it's a new data service that takes some of the data that's already on the GLA data store, which has hundreds of data sets about London generally, and it's augmenting that with really specialized, innovative data sets on things like mobile phone footfall, MasterCard spending, business types across hundreds of different high streets in London. And we've been doing analysis on some of the trends and the data to support the high street service over the last few months. It's intended to help local authorities understand recovery on their high streets. So if you are a local authority person in the audience and this sounds interesting, get in touch with me after and I can connect you with the data. But onto the maps. I just want to start by talking a bit about Central London, because I think, as everyone knows, you can go to the next point, please. Everyone knows that the activity has been much slower to recover than usual. The spending is down, the footfall is down. And next point, please. At no point in 2020 did the spending or the footfall in Central London recover to pre-COVID levels. You can see the map on the slide here is showing footfall levels in Central London from the 24th of May, from the week of the 24th of May. This is around midday. And most places are maybe around half of what they normally would be. And then you have a few areas on the fringe where the footfall levels for visitors are getting back up to normal or at normal. So there are areas like Regent's Park and Hyde Park that are attracting people back in. Next point, please. The good news is that the data that we've been looking at for footfall and spending in particular for Central London does suggest that visitors are more willing to come back in 2020. The recovery is happening a little bit quicker, a little bit more widespread. And retail spending in particular, for the last batch of data we had in May, is higher than it has been at any point in the pandemic. So that's good news for Central London and its businesses and its visitors, although the recovery is a little bit slower than other parts of London. Next slide, please. So if we're going to look at what's happening in the rest of London now, you'll see on the right here, you have this animation showing all the different high streets that we're looking at. Each of those dots is a high street, size of the dot, the size of the high street in hectares, and you can see them coming up in the order in which they recovered last year. These darker blues are the ones that recovered their retail spending earlier, and then you get this big burst of red right around Central London for the ones that didn't recover their retail spending at all. And that tracks with what I was saying on the last slide. It's just an extension of Central London in the sense that there aren't enough visitors and there aren't enough workers coming into those areas to keep the spending levels to what they normally would be. So those high streets have really struggled. In terms of the characteristics of high streets that have tended to recover quicker, they tend to be ones that are not in Central London. So they're a little bit farther, they're a little bit more in outer London, they tend to be a little bit smaller. And they tend to be ones that have higher footfall on Saturday rather than like throughout Monday to Friday. So they have a Saturday peak. And it's interesting to note that I think the smaller town center is taking less time to recover compared to the bigger ones. And it perhaps says something about the fact that our smaller high streets are serving people very well for their day-to-day necessities. Can you put the next point up, please? So what we saw in 2020 was that 70% of high streets throughout London recovered their pre-COVID spending levels by the end of September, which is pretty decent. Next point, please. But as of this year, when we're looking at the recovery since reopening, we've seen 87% of high streets recover their retail spending. So it's happening quicker this year, and it's happening on a wider scale. So those characteristics that I mentioned previously, they're still present, but they're not as influential necessarily in determining whether a high street is going to recover. And when we're thinking about the implications of this in terms of transport, in terms of the topic for today, if the smaller high streets are the ones that are recovering quicker, how do we make sure that those are properly accessible by walking and bike and bus so that all the people who are using those aren't just driving there and overloading those centers? We've already seen that this looks like it could be a car-led recovery, and we don't want to overwhelm our town centers with cars. Or instead, do we focus on getting people back into the bigger town centers? Or do we find a balance between the two? Next, please. This is just to bring things back for a moment to the characteristics that I was mentioning on the last slide. One of the interesting findings we've had, and we need to do a little bit more investigation on this, is that there might be a link between the median income of an area and its pace of recovery. So what you see on the graph here, we have the net median household income running along the top, and the dashed black line is the median income for households in London. The pink lines are the median incomes of the areas around the high streets that recovered in a given month. So if you're looking at the top of the graph, at the end of June, the high streets that had recovered their retail spending at that point tended to be in lower income areas. And if you look down at the bottom, the ones that didn't recover at all at any point last year tended to be in higher income areas. So there's an interesting finding potentially in here, and that could be linked to the fact that people who have higher incomes are more likely to be able to and to prefer shopping online, whereas people in lower income areas or lower income people don't have that option or choose not to. So they're using their high streets more compared to higher income areas, potentially. Can you put the point up, please? Thank you. What we see in 2021, as with the other characteristics, this is not as prominent, but the ones that haven't, the high streets that have yet to recover, they are in the higher income areas still. And just to give you some stats that aren't apparent on the slide, when we're looking at the 2020 data, 81% of high streets that were in the below median income areas, they recovered their retail spending last year, whereas 62.5% of high streets in the above median incomes recovered. So there's a bit of a disparity there. And to tie this back to the topic for today, implications in terms of transport, if it is the fact that lower income areas do rely more on their high streets or they face barriers to online shopping, we need to think about how we're safeguarding their walking, their cycling, their bus access to their high streets to get people there safely and efficiently. We also probably need to be thinking about the impacts of those online deliveries and the increase of vehicles and what neighborhoods those might be affecting based on some of this data, which we will be looking into and following up with in the coming months just to keep checking in on it. I'm going to hand back over to Martin now to wrap up our session.
Thanks, Amanda. So this data is high street vacancy by borough outside of the sort of central London zone. And it makes for pretty stark viewing that vacancies across the high streets were already on the rise and kind of reflects the sort of nature of what we've all kind of heard and know about what's going on around the country in terms of the high street. But it's quite clear at the moment when we kind of sort of take this kind of reading of what's going on that COVID has had an exacerbating kind of impact on high streets and on vacancy rates. So if we just kind of move to the next slide. So we're going to start to thinking about how we can kind of readdress this balance and some of the work which we do and some of the things which we've seen. So we think that the sort of the way to address the high street has to be this sort of top-down kind of bottom-up approach. And we kind of started by looking at who owns the high street. And it's pretty clear that kind of the majority of the sort of freeholds and retail shops and the high streets are owned by institutions, kind of REITs, investors. And they've got a pretty kind of sort of traditional model of, you know, getting multiple retailers in and trying to sort of command the highest rents. And I think that model is starting to wane a little bit. So I think there's going to be a need by the owners to start to think differently about the high streets and their own assets and start to think about different ways and different models to promote occupancy and vibrancy. So thinking about kind of looking at co-working, leisure uses, and some of the kind of new retail sort of uses that are going on. And then I think that can start to attract developers and investors back into the high street. So we're in a transitional period, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens after COVID. And then there's the role of councils. So we do a lot of work with councils who are taking more interest in the high streets. They're being more acquisitive. They're providing more financial support to try and get some of these kind of redundant assets back into use and try to sort of diversify the offer. Because what we found through the research is that kind of areas that have a mixed offer based around retail tend to perform better. So we think there's just going to be kind of opportunities, and there'll be a transitional period which we have to work through. And so just to finish our session on the next slide, so kind of closing thoughts for us, it's very much a kind of an evolving situation. We are getting more data. Amanda's getting more data and analysing it. So hopefully when we come back in September, we'll be able to provide an update to all of this. We think there's a clear sign that COVID-19 is exacerbating the stress on the high street, which is already being felt there. But we do think that in kind of adversity, there's always opportunities for investment and for people to do interesting things, and there genuinely seems to be an opportunity to do that right now. And then kind of relating it back to this point around, is recovery happening faster in smaller outer London high streets? What does that mean for this polycentric growth that favours intensifying bigger metropolitan and major centres? So that's we'll hand over to Phil, I believe. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Martin and Amanda. And that's some really interesting and revealing statistics there, and also a kind of similarly emerging pattern with the donut model. Moving on to spatial trends and implications, this is led by Phil Berczuk, a little bit for myself. Phil is Director of Steer. He's working with clients worldwide to help move to more compact, resilient and sustainable development models. He's leading the citywide implementation of Toronto's TO360 wayfinding project and directing 3 gender equity and mobility projects in Mexico as part of the UK's Prosperity Fund. I'll hand you over to Phil, who's going to talk about how ready the London structure is to accommodate these potential impacts and changes.
Thanks very much, Gavin. And good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk through some analysis our Steer's geospatial analytics team have done on the application of the 15-minute city model to London, and consider how that model relates to both the mobility trends and the retail spend analysis that we've just seen in the previous 2 presentations. And I'm then going to pass on to Gavin, who will talk a little bit more about how that might impact on changes to London's urban structure, and some detail on the TfL recovery scenarios that will help inform our thinking as to what we might be doing in the next stage of this this piece of work. So I'm sure most, if not all of you, have heard about the 15-minute city. It's gained a lot of traction over COVID, and it's gained a lot of traction from various cities worldwide, as well as NGOs and other organisations such as C40 Cities, who've adopted the concept as one of the key pillars of their agenda for a green and just recovery. The 15-minute city at its heart is about minimising the need to travel. It's about proximity and the provision of your day-to-day services and amenities and facilities within a 15-minute walk of your place of residence. And it's gained a lot of traction because that speaks to how many people have been behaving over the course of COVID, with an increase in working from home. That's not a new trend, but that trend, as with the other trends that we've been hearing about, has certainly been accelerated as a consequence of COVID, to such a point that both business and government are looking at policy change to support those behavioural changes and travel changes into the future. Next slide, please. So the analysis that we undertook was based on breaking down those services into essential, desirable and comprehensive. And that considers from primary and secondary education, supermarkets, green space, health services, local transport, leisure, and food and drink as your 8 essential services. Desirable strategic public transport, because it's not that we won't need to travel in the future between neighbourhoods. That'll still take place because you're not going to have everything everywhere. But it's not essential for your 15-minute neighbourhood to work locally. And then comprehensive are the things that we would like to have for activities that you wouldn't normally expect to have locally. So cultural spaces, further education, sports venues, for example. Next slide, please. And we applied this based on the idea that cities are made up of a series of connected neighbourhoods and connected places. London's very much a city of neighbourhoods, and it's grown over the centuries in that way. So when we see the analysis, it's no surprise really that London is actually reasonably well connected. But then London's also connected to its to suburban centres and suburban towns and satellite towns. Historically designed as the garden cities, and these form part of a dense interconnected mesh that require reliable public transport connectivity to get to and from those centres. Next, please. So this graphic shows, based on 200-metre hex cells, an analysis of the availability of those services mentioned in the previous slides within a 15-minute walk. Red's poor and blue is very high. And unsurprisingly, central London is actually very, very well set up with access to the majority of those services across most of central London, both within the central activity zone and beyond. Next slide. But the edges perform more badly. When we looked at density of population, again, it's not that surprising to find that the central zone of London, within the North Circular, let's say, has the greatest density of population, and with some high density zones certainly moving up the Upper Lee Valley and down to the south. Next slide. But then when we look at the travel trends, how does that correlate? Because we've heard from Magda and Adrian about the increase in travel in outer London, shown in the lighter areas, and then the significant drop in public transport demand in the inner London zones. But is that actually that surprising when you think that the inner London zones are constructed effectively as 15-minute cities, 15-minute neighbourhoods? You don't need to travel if you're living in those areas very far to access the things you need for your day-to-day life. Whereas, can we just go back, please? Whereas in the outer zones, there's a greater need to travel because you have less access to your day-to-day needs within an easy walk of where you live. And there may well be other factors at play. But it's interesting to see how these trends go together. And equally, is it that much of a surprise then, if there's no travel into central London, that the economic spend is lower or the economic recovery is lower? Because the people who are living in those zones aren't necessarily the people who are spending money in those shops or restaurants or bars and so on. It's the visitors, the commuters, and the tourists who would normally be spending time walking and enjoying the amenities and facilities in central London. Next, please. When we look at essential and desirable services, 42% of Londoners have access to all 9 of the desirable services, including strategic transport. When we look at the next slide, that drops significantly to 16% when we add in cultural spaces and further education. And across both of these pieces of analysis, the main gaps are cultural spaces, further education, secondary education, interestingly enough, and strategic transport. So whilst London's got a very comprehensive transport network, the strategic connections aren't necessarily available across the whole of the city. We think about Thamesmead, for example. One of the reasons why it's a development opportunity is because it doesn't have that transport connectivity at present. And part of what we've been doing is starting to look down into this analysis to understand what's happening at a more granular level underneath the kind of top picture that we're seeing here. Next slide, please. And then looking forward, we're thinking about how does this apply to the London Plan Opportunity areas. So the Upper Lee Valley, for example, Bexley Riverside, Thamesmead Abbey Wood, Heathrow. What does this tell us about the shaping of these areas in the future and the sorts of policy requirements and planning requirements that should be embedded in future developments in order to enable them to be more sustainable and more self-supportive as 15-minute neighbourhoods. And we also need to look at how does this apply on an equity level by saying, well, the 15-minute neighbourhoods tell us where there are big gaps in the current provision of services and amenities. And interesting to see the Marmot report that's been in the press over the last couple of days and the correlation between COVID, poor availability of services, particularly in Manchester, and accessibility. Next slide, please. And I think this is to Gavin.
Thanks, Phil. And obviously, you can see from Phil's 15-minute city modelling a kind of emerging theme again about obviously it's the central and inner areas of London that are set up really to be the most sustainable, accessible kind of urban form. And yet, if you look at the kind of current trends with the empty centre, the donut model, if you like, with the empty offices and shops, lack of recovery, the increased suburban and peripheral traffic, and obviously the kind of talk of out-migration from London itself. It's in effect a sort of decentralizing model, an unsustainable model, at least by current thinking. And I suppose it's just really for question: is it, to what extent do we consciously need to think of rebalancing it to make sure that we capture the opportunities and within the inherent structure of London to make it more sustainable? And does that mean, if there will be more vacancies in the future and whatever office or shopping or whatever building stock there is, do we need to consider repurposing some with a more dynamic mix of uses in the central areas? And this can be done obviously in parallel with intensifying the outer areas and trying to deal with the kind of increased traffic and so on in a more sustainable way, so that this is in effect, whilst it feels like a risk and a threat to the structure of London, some of these trends, there is the opportunity to grasp it and deal with it and try to make it, to rebalance the city, to make it more equitable and sustainable across all zones, if you like. And the next slides are just diagrams, I suppose, just kind of indicating, if you like, the three zones of London in simple terms: central, inner and outer. And the threshold between inner and outer, more or less, as Phil alluded to, being the kind of north and south circulars. But currently, obviously, we do have an empty centre. We've got increased local activity in the inner and outer areas, and a trend towards decentralisation. And whether actually, next slide, whether there is an opportunity and to what extent it needs to be consciously managed or not, to repurpose and to rebalance by invigorating new mixed uses and so on, in parallel with promoting more sustainable transport, so that we can work together to create and build on the sort of healthy streets and rich and mixed use buildings model. So again, food for thought. And then also moving towards the Q&A session, just to give a bit of a background, as Adrian mentioned, TfL have identified 5 scenarios that they are modelling to inform where they should plan strategically over the next 10 years. And I think they're not obviously mutually exclusive scenarios, but worth considering. Obviously, the one of the scenarios is return to business as usual, which is essentially just, it goes back to pre-COVID without any kind of major impact, and back to London Plan as is, and we carry on as per usual. There's a second scenario, which is less optimistic, and which is one of a sort of contracting London as a result of kind of decreased global impact and UK politics, shifting the centre from London, if you like. So London is kind of left on its own, sort of underfunded, which again impacts quite a lot on TfL's fare box, if you like. Scenario 3 is called low carbon localism, which is a sustainable scenario, but also assuming some form of contraction where London becomes more local and recognises there's a loss of international prominence in terms of, I suppose, business and commerce as well as tourism, but operates on a local level in a sustainable way. And a fourth scenario, remote revolution, is where we grasp the technological opportunities to create a different type of London. So that technology kind of is in response to changing work patterns, which again has a different trend, because that will probably embrace all sorts of new mobility solutions and different types of working solutions. Again, as an impact on how TfL is fare box, if you like. And then the final one, which is called agglomeration, which is a sort of rapid expansion as London tries to strive out and reposition itself within the global market. It expands, but at the risk of creating more inequalities across the city. So there are opportunities, I suppose, in an increased fare box in this one, but obviously there are downsides across the city in terms of an equitable and fair city. So these are all for just a sort of food for thought, and they're certainly going to be sort of driving our food for thought on how we explore the next stage. But I think, obviously conscious of time, probably hand over to the next session, which is the questions and answers. And we've had quite a few questions. I'm going to read them out. There's one from Tony Seilinger, who says the pandemic has offered us the opportunity to commute on less crowded tube trains and buses. Although counterintuitive, how can the quality of these public goods be improved to make the journeys to work less tiring? We need to continue to have lively and vibrant cities and towns. Adrian, do you want to have a thought about that? How we answer that? I suppose that's about saying there's a joy in an empty train, is that right? But it's not that.
Well, I think this is a great opportunity, really. Yeah. Public transport, particularly to and from the central activity zone, has all been about cramming people on. It's actually been quite an unpleasant experience. But we have got the opportunity now, I think. We could go to a system where you could almost be guaranteed a seat, have full space. We could improve the quality of public transport. Obviously, someone's got to pay for it, but I think that it is a big opportunity to grasp. Yeah, certainly.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. I have a question here from Peter Bourne, which says, do you think that there is a case to reduce in-town retail floor space? I think that's one for Martin and Amanda.
I think there is. I think that it's a pattern that was already kind of out there anyway in kind of most local plans. You know, places are kind of overshopped. You know, most high streets in the UK have got 2 shopping centres and, you know, a bunch of kind of retail units on the high street. And I think that for a while now there's been too much. So, but I think before we kind of look at kind of reducing them and do drastic things, we need to look at repurposing them. So I think there's a whole range of things that we can do around kind of activating them through leisure uses, kind of trying to encourage dwell time, and people who are, as we move to kind of more online shopping, still want to use their town centres and their high streets, and even kind of bringing public services into the centre. I mean, one of the things that we've experienced through some of the work we do with Guy's and St Thomas's is that lots of their service provision is going to be pushed further out into the community. So, you know, if there is void and vacancy on the high street, then why shouldn't they be starting to use those kind of assets and starting to animate them in that way? But yeah, I think that pattern is just going to sort of carry on, and I think there probably is too much retail floor space at the moment.
Thanks, Martin. Another question from Ali Moorhead from Atkins. Now that travel demand is so unpredictable, what are the panel's thoughts on the tools available to transport authorities in terms of their ability to encourage and manage movement patterns going forward? If we simply leave trends to market forces, the donut model may prevail. And as everyone knows, donuts have a hole in the middle. Is that what we want for our urban centres? So who wants to answer that one? Is that a steer question? Phil, do you want to?
I can start with that. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to note lately, a couple of weeks back, that the rail network introduced a flexi pass that provides for 8 days travel a month, rather than obliging people to have a 5-day travel, a 5-day a week monthly travel pass. So there's already initiatives taking place and changes taking place in how people pay for travel in response to the belief that people aren't going to go back to 5-day a week in the office, and that some level of flexible working will continue. Adrian, if you want to add anything further to that?
Yes, I was thinking, I mean, there's been quite a lot of talk again about whether we charge for road use as you're using the roads. So putting equity considerations on one side, that could actually be a very good way of actually managing travel demand around the capital, so that people are only driving when you want them to and where you want them to. And overlaid on that, and again with the support of central government, which hopefully you'll follow through into funding, a lot of interest in enhancing walking and cycling provision, which again I think is very important in outer London, where that has traditionally not been so good. Again, as a means of catering for short trips, to make sure they are being undertaken on foot or by cycle whenever possible.
Just to jump in here as well, I think there's a capacity point here, and so like a continued commitment to the sort of renewal. So things like the Brighton Main Line upgrade into central London, Crossrail 2, metroisation agenda, all of this kind of sort of improvement creates capacity, and those are the tools that will kind of encourage people to travel safely and comfortably into the centre in the long term. Whereas if things just sort of, if we go back to a normal, anybody who's travelled on the Northern Line at 8 AM on a Monday morning will know it's pretty unpleasant, and that's just going to make the situation worse.
Great, thanks. Another question, this is one specifically for Amanda from Julio. Has a correlation of speed of high street recovery and car ownership been analysed? It might be that high car ownership areas have led to slower high street recovery, and it might be a good political point to facilitate a more balanced mobility away from cars.
Thanks. That no, we haven't done that, but I think it's a really interesting thing that we could look into. So it's one that I'll bring up with the GLA next week. I think it's definitely worth us doing a bit of investigation on. I suppose the challenge with that is just unpicking whether the spend increase or decrease, if there is a correlation, is in fact due to the car ownership, or how you untangle that from other factors. But certainly as a characteristic to throw into the mix, it would be an interesting one for us to look at. So thank you very much for the idea. It's very helpful.
Thanks. Here's another one, I think, from Peter Bourne. Rather than remixing, making outer London feel like central London, or accept that central London had outgrown its capacity. So that's, if I'm interpreting that, that's saying, let the donut be. Is that correct? If I hope I'm interpreting that correctly. What do people think about that? Does someone want to, Phil, do you want to talk to that, given your modeling on the 15-minute city? Phil?
I'm not quite sure how to respond to that question, to be honest.
I'm assuming the position that I think we are sort of intuitively coming from, obviously we need to test it, is that the most accessible areas of London are the central and inner area, and we know that that's the most sustainable form for development. So I think rather than we might be accepting that central London may not grow more, but if there's a lack of footfall and emptiness to it and vacant buildings, then we should do something positive about that, because it's still strategically incredibly well positioned for what is recognised to be the best principles of sustainable living. That would be.
Yeah, I'm not sure that central London has outgrown its capacity, and I'm not quite sure, Peter, what you mean by outgrown its capacity. I think central London certainly suffered greatly as a consequence of COVID, because it's reliant to a much greater degree than much of the rest of London on commuting and on visitors. And the lack of that footfall from people travelling into central London every day, which is how London has been planned over the last decades, the lack of that footfall has resulted in a drop off the edge of the cliff for economic activity, particularly economic activity in retail related to office and other businesses. I think rebalancing that in local neighbourhoods by providing a better availability of, for example, local workspaces, providing a greater mix of retail opportunities when the GLA's looked at high streets as part of the High Streets for All. One of the questions is, what's the quality of these local high streets? What's the retail mix, rather than simply sorry, I had a phone call coming there unexpectedly. Rather than simply saying, do you have access to high street? Because the analysis says 90% of Londoners have access to a high street within 10 minutes walk. But how good is that high street? What's the offer there? What's the opportunity? And so I think looking at the remixing is saying, what do we actually need in our local neighbourhoods and our local communities in order to stimulate growth, to stimulate local activity? And what do we also need in central London if we need to reshape it and reutilise some of the office space if that's not required in the future, in order to create activity for a different kind of London experience?
Great, thank you. Thanks, Phil. Well, I guess I do have more questions, but I think we're probably running out of time. We have reached our end of our slot, but we do have a note of all these questions, so we're happy to get back to people if that helps. Yeah, thanks everyone for thanks also to all the speakers. I hope you enjoyed it. I've certainly enjoyed listening to all these experts, and I think it's been a really informative session. I hope people have found that themselves. As a summary, taking forward, it does appear, obviously, one of the key factors which seems to run through all of the presentations is this model of the kind of donut or the empty center with the increased activity, whether that is in terms of retail or congestion or traffic to the outer areas as an emerging theme. That is something I think we're going to be taking forward to look at more detail, and perhaps looking at, again, the scenarios that TfL have made and testing them, and perhaps in one or two locations to see what we think are there themes which run through all of these, or constants, or emerging things that we should be doing, which capture the best outcomes or prevent the worst outcomes at the same time of all the different scenarios. Is there a common theme that runs through everything that we should be doing? I think that will be our idea to take forward. We hope, obviously, today's been lots about bars and graphs. The next session, I think, hopefully, will be more about ideas as well, and testing actual kind of sites and positions as well. And obviously, we'll be in a much better position to know where we are in September than we are now. Hopefully, coming free on the 19th of July, if all goes to plan. And then also, hopefully we can have this next session in September not as a virtual experience. So thank you everyone for attending. I hope you've enjoyed it. We've really enjoyed starting this discussion. It feels like amongst us is sort of the beginning of a journey of discussion, and we really hope that we can study some really interesting trends and see what kind of recommendations we're able to make. So we're looking forward to the next session, and I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you too want to come to the next session.